everyone. Welcome to The Final Four is Not on the Schedule. I'm your host, Eric, alongside with expert analyst Rod. Thanks for joining us on the best MSU basketball podcast featuring an in-depth recruiting, game matchup, and post-game analysis. We dive deep to give you the best tools to enjoy the Spartans and impress your friends and family. Hey everybody, it's Eric alongside Rod. We're here for a quick update on recruiting and also to talk about Michigan State's non-conference schedule, which was just released. It is, of course, opening day as we're recording this for Michigan State's football season, so that, of course, is where most of our attention is towards, but we always have a sidelong glance towards what's going on in basketball, since this is the Final Four on the schedule, which is a basketball podcast. So this hopefully gets some listening enjoyment, maybe on your return back from the Spartan Stadium, or maybe after the game, hopefully after victory, we'd assume, against Central Michigan. Before we begin, I just want to remind you that you can support the show, just like Ken Kramer. Thanks again, Ken, for supporting the show with a one-time payment via PayPal. You can find ways to do that via PayPal or Venmo at thefinalfoursontheschedule.com/support. You can also find ways of giving us a recurring gift through Patreon or Substack, which is a way to help support the show, as well as our other sponsors of the show. So let's go over, I guess, real quickly, the non-conference schedule. In Michigan State, it's always funny. I always do a countdown from the first 56 days before the opening day, and it is sometimes tight with Michigan State because they're so late in getting their non-conference schedule out compared to all the other Big Ten teams. Because I think the rest of the Big Ten had their schedule out probably 2 weeks ago.
Depends on the school, but a lot of them, yeah.
Yeah. So anyway, we'll just go over the schedule. There are 2 exhibition games this season. There's, of course, the Hillsdale, which is their sort of typical on October 25th. It's, of course, in East Lansing. This year, an unusual circumstance that Tennessee, which was a closed scrimmage that they had in Knoxville last year, they were planning on doing a closed scrimmage again in East Lansing this year because I think Izzo and Mike Barnes are
Rick Barnes.
Rick Barnes, sorry, thank you. Are really tight friends, is my impression.
Yep.
But because of what happened in Maui, they decided to open it up to, it's going to be televised in some format. We're not sure at this point. It's going to be at the Breslin Center, and it's going to be open. And so I don't know if that's going to be part of the regular ticket holders or if it's going to be an additional sort of thing. I'm not quite sure how it's going to work at this point. The details aren't out. I intend on being there if I can. And that, of course, is going to support the victims and sort of the destruction that happened in Maui and Lahaina. Yeah. Just a week ago, I guess now, as we're recording this. So those would be the 2 exhibition games. And then the regular season begins on November 6th, which will be James Madison. And then there'll be a second game on November 9th, Southern Indiana, before Michigan State plays in the Champions Classic and takes on Duke on the 14th. Then the Gavitt games return to East Lansing, where Butler comes back to school, and I think, it was a road game last season at Butler for the Gavitt games.
No, that was 2 years ago.
Was it 2 years ago?
Gavitt games last year was at home against Villanova.
Oh, yeah, you're right. Yeah, okay. Yeah. So, okay, that makes more sense because I was going to say it seems like weird that you play the same team back-to-back with the Gavitt games, but obviously you're right. So Butler's coming in, still a pretty depleted squad from last year. Then the 19th, another home game against Alcorn State. And the 23rd, which is Thanksgiving, which will be out in Palm Springs against the Wildcats from Arizona. And I think actually Alcorn State and Arizona are part of technically a multi-team event, a tournament.
Yeah.
I can't remember the name of it, but it's obviously
I think it's AccuSure, I believe.
Yeah, there you go. Which is, I think, related to one of the large donors for the.
There's a Michigan State connection. That is correct.
Somehow. Yeah. Then we'll have a bye game, the tomato can. Georgia Southern comes in on the 28th. And then there's a big game, which will be in Detroit, which will be against Baylor on the 16th of December. The 18th of December will be Oakland at home, and then Stony Brook on the 21st. And then a matchup against the Sycamores on December either the 29th or the 30th right now, which, if you've been around a while, the last time they played was 1979 in the national championship game with Bird and Magic. And who knows what sort of connection they'll have if both those players will be there. I don't know. Nothing's clear at this point as they're announcing it. And obviously in that schedule too, there are going to be 2 Big Ten games sandwiched probably December 5th through 10th or 15th or something like that, where they have one away and one home game.
they'll be in that gap between November 28th and December 16th. So if you're looking at the schedule and you see that, you know, basically 2 week gap, more than 2 week, 2.5 week gap, and think that's strange, don't.
Yeah.
There will be two games that will get plugged in there. And frankly, that's why also the Big Ten not yet having announced the schedule is why that Indiana State game is still up in the air as to whether it'll be the 29th or the 30th, because it's going to depend on when Michigan State comes back into Big Ten play. That'll determine which of those 2 days.
Exactly. They could be playing January 2nd, and so you think,
right,
well, let's play the 29th instead of the 30th, So we'll start, I guess, with a discussion on this. Let's just begin, I guess, first with the exhibition game, because that's very unusual with the Tennessee, and then we'll kind of talk about some other subjects after that.
Yeah, obviously, the first one against Hillsdale, as you said, is more of the garden variety game that Michigan State plays against they often play a D2, sometimes a D3 opponent. So that's par for the course. But the fact that Tennessee is an exhibition rather than a closed scrimmage is unusual. And this has, I believe there are at least 3 of these that have been announced thus far that are all going to be, I believe, donating money to the situation in Maui. Cool. Illinois and Kansas was actually the first one to announce. So that's Bill Self's return to play the school that he coached at. God, it's 20 years ago now. Hard to believe. Yeah. It's been that long, but yeah, that's one of them. And I'm drawing a blank on what the third one was. Michigan State was the second to announce, Michigan State, Tennessee. And then there's been a third that's been announced as well. Obviously great cause. So you start with that. But this is, as I think you noted, Michigan State played at Tennessee last year, and that was a closed scrimmage. And those things have come into vogue in recent years. The standard had always been, well, if I go way back, the standard was you played exhibition games against touring teams. And once upon a time, it used to be national teams. So, for example, Michigan State in the national championship season of 78-79 played the Russian national team, which was that Soviet national team,
right,
which was then, generally considered to be the second best amateur basketball team in the world, behind whatever the U.S. Olympic team would be. And Michigan State beat them in a competitive game. And that was, if you needed to know how good Michigan State was, that was a pretty good indicator, the fact that they beat them. Then there were also these other things. The big one was Athletes in Action. And I'm sure that the people of a certain age listening to this will remember that name. Athletes in Action used to have, they might have even had multiple teams for all I know, but they had at least one team. It was I don't know if it was non-denominational Christian associated, but it was associated with Christianity. And it was ex-college players who weren't pros that would tour. And, there were obviously, they were raising money for the organization. And there was also some, and I'm using this in a very loose term, evangelical process that was attached to it. But they would play. Marathon Oil used to sponsor a team. And so you would see those would be your exhibition games. Then it started to change to, playing D2s and D3s. And then even more recently, you started seeing these closed scrimmages. And the initial stages, and my memory may be slightly off, but I want to say this started to come into vogue maybe about a decade or so ago. And it would typically be, Michigan State wasn't a participant in these things typically. I remember Michigan, John Beilein was an early adopter, and you would hear things come out of these closed scrimmages where Michigan would face, say, Toledo or Bowling Green, somebody like that, another D1, but a mid-major. In more recent years, like within the last 5 years, it's evolved yet again, and now you have serious power programs playing each other in these things. And it makes all the sense in the world, because it was perfect for coaches. It was closed scrimmages, so you don't have the pressure of fans looking at it and expecting a victory. And you can actually treat it in a more meaningful way, at least in terms of what the coaches want to accomplish. So it'll be interesting. The fact that they're labeling this an exhibition, I don't know if it's going to be exactly the same format. I tend to think it won't be, as these closed scrimmages have been, because my understanding is they treat those differently than just playing a game. It's
Yeah.
they'll play a segment or segments that will simulate a game, but then they might also do an extra period of time where they're attempting to address certain kinds of situations. I mean, this gets into stuff maybe that's much closer to the range of approaches that you see in spring football.
Right.
You know,
Yeah.
I
Special
don't.
teams practice and
Yeah,
2 minute drives or something like that.
exactly. At last year, Michigan State went to Tennessee. Tennessee was obviously very good, played down there, and the word was that Michigan State played extremely well until the tail end of the game, and Tennessee pulled away for a win, but it was very competitive. Michigan State showed up well, and I think that was the first solid indicator you had that Michigan State was likely to be improved, because Tennessee was expected to be really good, and in fact they were.
Hmm.
I believe they got to the Sweet 16 as well as Michigan State last year. They were a top 10 team for significant parts of the season. They took out Duke last year in the tournament. I remember
Yeah.
that.
Right.
Um, so very good team. You mentioned Rick Barnes is a good friend of Tom Izzo's. Their programs and the things they value, the approaches are not 100% down the line the same, but there's a lot of crossovers, a lot of similarities. Fans may remember Michigan State played Texas pretty frequently when Rick Barnes was there. They had home and home series against Texas. So there's a long-standing relationship there. Tennessee is once again expected to be very good, uh, on the fringes of the top 10 again in the
Hmm.
preseason. So this should be a really good early test, and especially if it's treated more or less like a game. I'm not sure it will be. I wouldn't be surprised if you see different playing combinations, maybe going a little deeper into the bench for significant minutes than we would normally see. But still, it should be great. And the fact that we're all going to be able to see it is an added bonus.
For sure. Yeah. I mean, as a ticket holder, and again, I don't know if this is an extra one I have to purchase or something, but to have a good team in town would be really
I
nice. I
gotta
mean,
believe it is. I gotta believe it is, because it's a charitable. There's a charitable purpose here, so they're
yeah.
looking for money.
Yeah.
So
Above and beyond the usual athletic department money,
right, right.
seeking activity. Yeah. And it'll be great to have them. I mean, Butler's coming in. That's the big name, I guess you'd say, for the non-conference, which is, not a bad name. It's just not probably a great team.
For
Yeah.
Breslin, I think you count the Baylor game as a quasi home game, even though it's down here in Detroit.
Yeah.
Um, you know, that's
Yeah.
the big one. But you're right. For Breslin, Butler would be the highlight.
Yeah. Uh, so then let's talk about some other things. The interesting thing about the non-conference schedule too is there are no road games, no true road games. I mean,
Yep.
obviously they're playing out in Palm Springs. Usually Michigan State plays in a multi-term event, like, multi-team event like Maui, Invitational, Battle for Atlantis, Alaska Shootout, all those sorts of things. They obviously don't have one this year. I think this is somewhat a reflection that there's no ACC Big Ten Challenge anymore. That's, part of
For
the
sure.
trash
For
heap of
sure.
history, so that it doesn't exist anymore. And so you're not guaranteed a road game every other year. But I think it's a little unusual. And maybe my guess is that this is probably going to be an aberration for no true road games for Michigan State.
Yes.
Would be my hunch. And I think, looking at the schedule, you can certainly think to yourself, Baylor might be it next year. Just, the way things
Yep.
come out, unless
Yep.
Gavitt Games throws one for Michigan State as well.
Well, so here's the thing. The first, that's absolutely true. The first surprising thing to me, I'm not quite sure why MSU is not on the road in the Gavitt games. The only thing I can think of is that the more important thing to the organizers of that event, and believe me, I'm sure Fox has a role in that since they're the televising partner. But perhaps the more important thing was simply they wanted that matchup rather than worrying about, well, Michigan State was at home last year in the Gavitt games playing Villanova. They should be on the road because, as you noted, you just had the year wrong.
Yeah.
Michigan State played at Butler 2 years ago. So they might not have wanted to repeat that, yet they wanted Michigan State to face Butler for whatever reasons. So that's where the road game could have come. The ACC challenge is gone. Now, I happen to think, I'm pretty sure I've got this right, that ESPN has scratched the standing SEC Big 12 challenge and are replacing that with an ACC SEC challenge. So the Big 12, it seems to me, has an opportunity, has an opening.
Yeah.
And I think I would anticipate, I'd be kind of surprised if by next season we don't see a Big 10, Big 12 challenge, which would be great from a basketball point of view because the Big 12 has been outstanding. And frankly, with the new teams they're bringing in, they've added, programs like Cincinnati and Houston. That league's only gotten even better from a basketball perspective. So that would be a hell of an event just in terms of quality. Yeah, I think it would lack, the Big 12's got, again, great basketball programs. The thing about the ACC challenge is you had North Carolina and Duke.
Exactly.
The Big 12 has Kansas.
But it's not as sexy and then nobody, for the lay fan. Yeah.
Well, but you could argue Kansas is in there as a draw with Carolina and Duke, but there's no second team at that level.
Yeah, sure.
So but purely from a quality point of view, that would be great. Assuming that happens, I think the chance of, as you said, alternating years where you're going to have road games as part of that event, like MSU last year went to Notre Dame. That was the true road game. Right. It was part of the ACC challenge. We don't like to forget that one, but it did happen.
Thanks a lot.
I think you're right about Baylor. That's probably a road game next year, although perhaps it would be like this one at a quasi, semi-neutral site in Texas. Maybe they play it in Dallas or, Houston. I don't know where. But that one has the look. I would agree with you there as well. It has the look of that. So that's, from Tom Izzo's perspective, I would guess this aspect of the schedule is not totally ideal because he likes having that kind of challenge where they got to go into a road environment and play somebody that's capable of beating them. I mean, there have even been years where I remember several years ago, I couldn't believe Michigan State did it. They actually agreed to play a road game at Bradley, which is a tough place to, anywhere in the Missouri Valley Conference, if you're going on the road, that's tough. And they've occasionally done those kind of things. I want to say there was a year they went to Bowling Green, maybe. They've done some of these things on rare occasions in the past, but not this year. So they don't have that element to it. They do have, as we said, they've got a neutral, technically 3, but let's call it 2.5, since not even half, since Baylor is still really a home game. Duke and Arizona both in neutral sites. And that's as close as you get.
Yeah, I mean, and I would say the other thing, looking at the schedule, you could also imagine them going to Indiana State next year. I mean, that'd be the other possibility, right? That's
sure.
I would notice too that when it comes to Oakland, Oakland is every other year at Breslin, and the other year it's always in Detroit, just because it's a bigger draw, obviously. And then you almost see maybe this is a plan by Michigan State to try and play a game in Detroit every year, because of course now you're playing Baylor when you're on the off year. You're not playing Oakland. I don't know if that's a strategy from exposure
Wouldn't be
standpoint,
surprising,
but they're always thinking about other things too, right?
Yep. I think you're quite possibly right about that. I do know that that's something they like to do, and perhaps they've reached the point where they've decided, hey, that's something we want to try to do every year, one way or the other. The Indiana State thing will be interesting. You mentioned the Bird Magic elements. This is the first time since that game that the two schools have met.
Hard to believe in some ways.
Yeah, it is, because of proximity, and MSU has faced not a lot of Missouri Valley teams, because that's a tough one. Scheduling a Missouri Valley team is difficult because they play a really good caliber of basketball in that league, and you don't get credit for beating those teams from
Right.
fan bases at least, but those are tough games. And yet those programs are all healthy enough that they're not in the position that a Stony Brook or a Georgia Southern or Southern Indiana is, where they're
Yeah.
just, it's a buy game. It's money that they need for their programs. Indiana State's basketball program, I would guess, is okay financially. The
Sure.
Missouri Valley does very well in terms of draws. You know, the number of people that they have in the stands, they actually do very, very well from an attendance perspective. So those schools, I guess my point is, those schools aren't as pressured to maybe be willing to go on the road or, you know, just exclusively play a Big Ten team on the road without a corresponding home date. And they've said nothing about this being a home and home. So we'll see. But I would be kind of surprised if they're not going to turn this into something that's fairly attention grabbing, meaning trying to get guys from those teams in 79 to this game. Now,
Oh, yeah, for sure.
with Magic, it's the thing about it is he's always back here for the holidays.
Right.
Now, this is a little later than that, with this coming right just prior to New Year, but you never know. It might dovetail nicely with that. With Bird, I don't know. I don't know how often Bird even goes back to Terre Haute, but it'll be interesting to see what they can pull off. But knowing how Michigan State does these things, I've got to believe you shouldn't just expect it to be another game. And here's the other thing. That's going to be a very competitive game. Indiana
For
State
sure.
won
Yeah.
23 games last year overall, and they were on the plus side. They were a winning team in the Missouri Valley as well. They've got a lot back. That should be a very good team. I would rate that, in fact, when I look at the schedule, that's the fourth best opponent they play. Duke, Arizona, Baylor, pretty clearly 1, 2, 3, I think, in that order.
Right.
Not counting Tennessee here because that's an exhibition. And then I would say, at least in my view, I would rate Indiana State maybe a little bit ahead of Butler in terms of quality. I think Butler's probably going to be better because it's year 2 of Thad Matta's regime. And I am still a big believer in Thad Matta as a basketball coach. So I expect they're going to be better. They also have Pierre Brooks coming in that game to hopefully, I'm sure from his perspective, to gain a little something over his ex-teammates, his ex-coaches.
Exercise some demons. Yeah. Right.
Yeah. So, but Indiana State will be a tough game. You know, aspects of this I like. Michigan State's obviously getting tested well. You've got a preseason top 5 in Duke, a team kind of on the fringe of the preseason top 10 in Arizona, then a solid top 20 in Baylor, and then 2 other teams in Indiana State and Butler that I think are quality teams. And although you wouldn't expect either one to definitely be a tournament team, I think going into the season, they both would have reason to think that they've got a shot. So that's pretty good. That's a pretty good mix. The other thing I like about it, the schedule, a great deal, is we are used to, on an almost annual basis, having games that end up being scheduling losses. And it's usually got to do with time, a combination of timing and travel. So last year, for example, we talked about that game at Notre Dame. That was the epitome of a scheduling loss. There was just, that's what happened, flat out. Michigan State came off the Phil Knight thing in Portland and immediately went to South Bend. They were already banged up, so that didn't help. But that was a scheduling loss. And we see that frequently. They would have times when they'd be playing in Maui or playing some other event on the West Coast and then be flying back across to go play Duke at Cameron, you know, something like that, like 2 days later. I mean, we've had these kind of events before. When I look at this schedule, I don't see anything like that. There's some nice spacing. The closest you get to it is there's 3 games in 5 days where you've got Baylor, Oakland, and Stony Brook. But that's Detroit, East Lansing.
Yeah, that's not a problem. Yeah.
And the fact that the best of those 3 teams by far is up first, I like a great deal. Because that means you put everything into Baylor. And if you're a little bit tired for Oakland and Stony Brook, well, you should be able, by all rights, especially with the depth this team has to get through those. You'd rather have it that order than Oakland, Stony Brook, and then Baylor, for example.
Yeah.
So I look at this, it's just not, you got Southern Indiana 5 days until Duke. You've got 3 days between Duke and Butler, but it's only Chicago to East Lansing. So that's no big deal. Yeah, to me, it's a pretty manageable schedule. I think they're going to be tested at a high enough level that by the time it's done, we're all going to have a pretty good idea where Michigan State is. Are they legitimately, at least at that point in the season, playing at a national contender level the way we kind of expect them to? Or are there some issues that get brought to the surface by virtue of playing these good opponents? The only other thing I would say about it is, although it's good at the high end, usually what ultimately determines what your strength of schedule looks like from a metric perspective is where those other teams slot in. And it's just too early to tell. Are the James Madisons, the Southern Indianas, the Alcorn States, are those teams, say, ranked between, say, 200 and 250?
Like Minnesota?
Or are they right? Or are they teams in the 300 and below category?
Right.
And if you've got a lot of those, if you've got 3-4 of those in that range, that can really ding your strength of schedule a little bit. So that remains to be seen as to how that slots in. But I don't think you can really be particularly worried about that right now. I think to me, I look at this, I like this schedule. I really do. I think it accomplishes everything except maybe giving you that one true road test you would ideally like. Everything else, I think it does pretty well.
And of course, the only team that would not be affected by that scheduling, playing those tomato cans, as you put it, would be Ohio State, since they played them last year and still seem to be buoyed by the metrics despite their floundering in the Big Ten.
Yeah.
The inexplicable Ohio State matrix or something that happened last year. So let's talk about some recruiting stuff. I just want to remind you, I'm powering through a cold here, so I apologize a little bit for my voice. But, the one thing I don't have to worry about is I don't have to worry about my gutters. I don't have to power through and clean those things out because I had that all taken care of by the brothers Just Do Gutters. They do fantastic work. They're a great sponsor of the show. They've very supportive of Michigan State basketball. And so I'd love it for you guys to support them. I know we've had some listeners who have had them work on their houses, and they've been very pleased with the service and have been, thanks to you for reaching out to them too for that. You get 10% off your estimate by just mentioning Final Four. You have coverage if you're in the Grand Rapids out to the Lakeshore area. And if you're on the east side of the state and the entire Detroit metro area, Greg and his team will take care of you as well. So you are fully covered. You can check out the links to it underneath the podcast player, and you can get a hold of those guys at brothersgutters.com, and you won't regret it. They do fantastic work at a great price, and they get it done quickly. And I almost would say just about any weather, so you've got plenty of time, because even if it's not water that you're worrying about, like with rain in the next couple weeks, you can get all kinds of problems too with the leaves that are piled up or with the ice that comes up, which is, I don't want to talk about too much, but that is a reality of Michigan. So let's talk about some developments that happened in recruiting. We had, a show 2 weeks ago where we talked about the targets for Michigan State. And let's begin with 2024 target Jace Richardson, who's a son of Jason Richardson. So quite an interesting development, I guess. I thought it was interesting that he's going to be taking a second official visit to Michigan State. And I think we're the only ones he's had an official visit to this point.
Correct. And so by definition, Michigan State will be the only school who will have the opportunity to have him on a second official. This one kind of came quickly, and this is a big recruiting weekend. We're recording this, you say, Friday afternoon, just before tonight's football game. So this weekend has turned into a pretty important one for Michigan State, and the most important, at least in the near term, is Jace Richardson. So son of Jason Richardson. By the way, I just as an aside, and he did not pay me for our show for the shout out, the advertisement, but I just listened today to an interview on Jack Ebling's show. So it's The Drive with Jack. If you're not familiar, You can look that up on wherever you get podcasts, Twitter, etc. He's been having a series where he has Sean Respert as a guest host, and they do like 20 to 30-minute segment where they interview another Michigan State great. And so he's had like Eric Snow has been on there where they talked about fire and ice, etc. But the most recent one, the one I listened to today, is he had Jason Richardson. So the timing was
Nice.
great. And they talked about Jace a little bit. And Jason confirmed a lot of the things that I've heard through the grapevine. He, of course, he loves Michigan State, but he really thinks it's important to view recruiting as from a parent's perspective, not from an ex-Michigan State player's perspective, meaning that he wants his son to do what's best for him. Yep. And so he walked through all that. And of course, they reviewed his playing days and everything. I can't recommend highly enough listening to that whole series. I think they've done 5 episodes now. Very much worth your time. But in any event, Jace, I have gotten the sense as this year has progressed that Michigan State was in better and better position. I think there was a conventional wisdom a while back that this would be a tough recruitment for Michigan State to win because Jace did not grow up in Michigan.
Right.
He grew up in Las Vegas, and that's where he went to high school. He transferred to a school in Florida for this coming year, his senior year, but he'd played at Bishop Gorman in Las Vegas his first 3 years. He played for AAU teams based in the West, Vegas Elite, and then this year he was with Paul George, which is out of Southern California. So he doesn't have those connections to Michigan that his father had, obviously, growing up here. And it just didn't seem like it was likely, but that has changed because Michigan State has really recruited him well, and they've recruited him not as simply a legacy, but as his own guy. And I think there's a lot of optimism. Let's put it that way. I think the fact that this visit was scheduled is an additional sign that there's very much reason for optimism on this front. He did take an official about this time last year. It was last September. It was the only official he took during his junior year. He's got officials also scheduled for the near term to Alabama and Cincinnati. And interestingly, all along, the school that I've heard was the other most serious contender for him is Arkansas. And part of that is that Eric Musselman, Arkansas's head coach, coached Jason Richardson at Golden State for a while. So when he was in the NBA. So there's a relationship there the same way there's a relationship with Tom Izzo. But Arkansas, he has not scheduled an official visit with Arkansas. And maybe one will come yet this fall. So I guess you can't rule that out. But the longer it goes like this, the more it really starts to look to me like you put Michigan State in the driver's seat. I think that's started to become almost the conventional wisdom on this recruitment, is that Michigan State is in very, very good shape. Just to reiterate who he is as a player, he's not his dad. And on that Jack Ebling, Sean Respert episode I was talking about, they talk about that a little bit. Jace is a combo guard. He's 6'3", so he's not as tall as his dad was. He's not nearly the athlete, but then again, outside of Cohen Carr, who is? So that's not a knock. He is actually a very athletic guard. Don't think he's not an athlete. He's just not, all world. But he's a skilled guy. He's a competitor. He's got toughness. He fits the Michigan State mold. It seems very clear that Tom Izzo is hell-bent on having multiple legitimate ball handling options simultaneously, either in the same lineup or at least on the roster. You've seen it with this year's team where, Michigan State's got 5 guys, by my count, that in a pinch could play point guard on this year's team.
It's almost half the team.
Right. And I think That's the intention going forward. And so Jace Richardson would fit that. If you project into next year, theoretically, you could have Jace Richardson, Jeremy Fears, and Trey Holloman all together, all three of which could play with the ball with their hands a lot. So it makes a lot of sense, but his size at 6'3" helps because that means he's big enough that, at least in theory, he may be a good wing matchup defensively. The same way that Michigan State with Jaden Akins and AJ Hogard, they have some defensive versatility with those guys because they're a little bit bigger than a standard point guard might be. Well, Jace kind of could fit into that slot, that way of that mode of thinking as well. So very big deal. If Michigan State gets him, I mean, honestly, if they wrap up Jace Richardson, and I'm not expecting that it happens immediately after this visit, but you never know, it kind of feels like it's tracking for a fall decision. So we may know in the next couple months, at least. If they do get him, I think at that point, they just go into the spring. And I think we talked about this in our recruiting episode. And Bryson Tucker is the other guy that's on the radar.
Yeah, wait and see.
He probably doesn't, right. He probably doesn't decide until spring. And I think that's a great position for Michigan State. If you've got 3 guys in the class signed, then you go into the spring, you wait and see for sure what kind of attrition you have from your roster. You can wait on Bryson Tucker because he's good enough to wait on, and yet they don't have to feel forced to do anything. And then depending upon what happens on those two fronts, you're there at portal time. So it works out nicely. But right now, in my mind, it's really 2 guys left from the high school ranks. It's Jace Richardson, Bryson Tucker. So if you get one of those 2 guys committed in the fall, well, then you're in the catbird seat. I mean, you really are.
Yeah, it's been impressive to follow up the really great class they just brought in, to have another already what they have is a really good class, and just to add to that would be even more impressive.
If they sign Jace Richardson and Bryson, even just Jace Richardson, it would be a really good class. If they have Jace Richardson
exactly.
if they have Jace Richardson and Bryson Tucker to add to Kurtane and Jesse McCullough, that's a class very much on par with this year's freshman class. And to have those, as you say, back to back, really impressive. And it would be another indicator too of Tom Izzo running counter to the prevailing winds in college basketball, which are don't load up on high school players, keep slots available for the spring, hit the portal hard. That is increasingly the direction that a lot of the country seems to be choosing to go in. And I by that, I mean high majors.
Right.
And Tom Izzo, he's said it many times. He's not going to completely eschew the portal. He'll go to the portal when he feels he needs to, but his preference is still the same model he's always had. And if he puts a second, back-to-back classes of that caliber together, who's to tell him he's wrong?
Well, I mean, it may be a competitive advantage, right? I mean, it's until this plays its way out, you don't know who's got the right approach, and it's probably some sort of hybrid. But I mean, if maybe Musselman's not going after Richardson because he's wants to keep something open for the portal because he doesn't know what his needs will be next year. I mean, who knows what the coaches are putting it.
And you make a good point there, because Arkansas has been relentless since this era has started in terms of portal activity. I mean, they just, and that may be part of the analysis on the Richardson families. For all I know, I haven't heard this, but it would stand to reason. If I were a high school recruit thinking about Arkansas, my biggest concern would be, okay, I see my path right now, but what's going to happen in April and May?
Right.
Is this guy going to go crazy and sign 2 other guys who can play a similar role to me, but they've got 2 or 3 years of college experience under their belts, Whereas at Michigan State, you can be pretty certain as to what your path looks like when you're being recruited and when you sign. It's going to largely be the same, that you don't anticipate there will be radical differences. because Izzo decided to go crazy and sign 5 guys out of the portal.
Right.
I
Yeah.
don't think you could say that about some other programs. And Arkansas would be at the top of the list where you really can't have any idea what they're going to do. And in fact, if you were hedging your bets, the smart bet would be, yeah, expect them to be active in the portal because that's what they've done every year.
Right. Yeah, I think, with portal of Michigan State, it's oftentimes, well, I mean, it's like with most teams, you don't know where your departures are. You don't have a real good feel oftentimes for where
Right.
your personnels are going to be the next year. And so that's always going to be an uncertainty for any high school recruit coming in. But you at least don't have the added added concern of getting recruited over with,
Yeah.
players who are experienced. So let's go on to some other players. I don't know if we talked about Davian Hanna from
We did.
Wisconsin. Okay, yeah. So he's a 25 recruit, and so he's coming on an unofficial. So let's talk about him real briefly.
He may be an official. I
Oh,
think
okay.
he's an official. You can take officials as a junior, and he's entering his junior year.
Oh, sure, right. He
So
would be,
I
yeah.
I think he's an official. I'm not 100% on that, but I think he is. Big time player. You generally see him in the top 30 nationally in that class. 6'4", um, has some, they say, combo ability, but I think you think about him primarily as a wing, and just another really good player from traditional Michigan State Big Ten recruiting grounds. He's a Milwaukee kid. Schools you would expect to be involved there are involved. Marquette, Wisconsin, but Michigan State's been on him hard for a long time, and they are considered to have a very serious shot as of this point. So, um, you don't expect anything major on that front this early, but
Yeah.
good to be getting these guys in, these high level guys uh, in at this stage. And that's the thing that's so important about the way Izzo's been recruiting for the last couple of years. He's not taking stuff for the next class generally into the spring. Now, as we talked about, Bryson Tucker probably is going to be a guy like that, but that's one guy. It's not a big deal. You're not in a situation where you're like, well, we're still recruiting 3 guys for the 24 class into the spring. You know, what that means is you've got a lot of time and a lot of resources to develop to the younger classes and continue to foster and strengthen those relationships. So Davion Hanna coming in would be an example of that. There's an opportunity for Michigan State to do that.
And you could look at the recruitment of Kurtang and Jesse McCullough. They were committed early in the spring. I mean, and they feel obviously comfortable with those solid commitments. I don't know exactly when they did their officials either, but you wonder if that's the same thing. They're sort of on that timeline where you're looking at Hannah and thinking, oh, this is a guy who's going to probably commit by spring. If we get him in now, maybe he'll come.
Yep.
Maybe by March, he's going to feel comfortable just saying, all right, I'm done. I'm just going to enjoy my senior year of high school and my summer of AAU before my last summer AAU ball.
Yes, exactly. It becomes a domino effect. So the earlier you can get started on the younger classes, the more prepared you may be for them to make earlier decisions, and then the process repeats, right?
Right. And yeah.
So,
And you prevent them from going other places and seeing other, I mean, that's
right,
obviously part of it too, right?
right.
So, and one last thing too, and especially when we had a conversation with Garrick Normand, there's definitely, as soon as they start do that official, I think they definitely feel like, they're watching that season unfold. They kind of feel like they're part of the team in some respects, right? The team's communicating the players. And so they already kind of are part of that family. And so I think that is I think that's something that we've seen in the recruitment, at least people when they're stating why they came. I think that is all part of it, right? The sooner you get them in that sort of the atmosphere, and so they get sucked in, they sort of get sold on the program earlier.
It is a huge part of what Michigan State does. You hear it. Look, all places will blow smoke about, yeah, we have a family environment. We treat each other as a family. That's a cliche.
Yeah.
But at Michigan State, it has long been a reality. I'll bring up that Jason Richardson interview I listened to today. He talked about that. He talked about how when he was a junior in high school, Mateen Cleaves pulled him aside when he was there, on some kind of visit, or he might have even just been there for an open gym run, and told him, look, if you come here, we're going to win a national championship. and he ended up being a prophet. And he said from that point forward, he knew he was going to come to Michigan State, that he felt like he was on the team before he ever got there. And you hear the guys who end up look, that might not be for everybody and it might not matter to everybody. But the guys who end up at Michigan State, generally speaking, you hear some version of that as
Yeah.
one of the reasons why they came. So you're absolutely right. The more opportunities you get to have these guys on campus, which means the earlier you can start with them doing that, the more likelihood there is that you're going to develop those kind of bonds. And that all and then that hopefully what you hope for is that in turn, when and if they do come to Michigan State, that's going to mean that their relationships with teammates, with coaches, with the community are all better and deeper, which should help in terms of the team being better, all else being equal. We
Yep.
talk a lot about the value of chemistry, and it's another one of these cliches. Everybody talks about how important it is and how great the chemistry is that they've got. Well, it's not great everywhere. We know that. Um,
Yeah.
and even years at Michigan State, despite the fact that I think they put more emphasis on it than most. And even at Michigan State, it's not always that way. I mean, without rehashing it, there have been points in the Izzo era, there have been the odd season here or there where you could kind of see it that,
Hmm.
hey, this group has some divergent agendas. They don't seem as tight as some other ones. Generally speaking, when Michigan State is at their best, and I happen to think this current group seems to be really, really good in that respect. But generally speaking, when Michigan State's at their best, the chemistry's at its best, you know, and your odds are better for developing that the longer guys feel like they're really a part of it, even extending back to their recruitments.
All right, so let's talk about two unofficial visits for the 26s who are coming to East Lansing, TJ Crumble and Stephen Reynolds.
Yeah, so we'll start with TJ Crumble first. So he's a 6'7" forward. Again, going to be a sophomore this year from Cleveland. And last year, he was a teammate at Lutheran East of MSU incoming 2024 recruit Jesse McCullough. They won a state championship together. And TJ Crumble has since transferred to another high school, not a prep school, I don't believe, but another high school in Ohio. So they're not going to be teammates this year, but they've still got a very good relationship. I've seen some quotes from him that he's talked. I think this is his first visit, and he's talked a lot to Jesse McCullough about Michigan State already. So an Ohio kid, very much in Izzo's traditional wheelhouse in terms of where he likes to recruit. Very highly regarded. He's Crumbles seen as a top 30 guy at this stage in his class. So definitely a name to watch.
And then Reynolds.
And then Stephen Reynolds from Indiana is a 6'5" guard. Another one of these guys has some on ball skills, but also will play wing, play off the ball. Again, top 30 ish guy in his class, very highly regarded. Um, it's early days with these kind of guys
Sure.
when they're
Yeah.
just starting they're in the first few days right now of their sophomore years in high school. So it's hard to have a concrete feel for where they're going to end up. But generally speaking, when Michigan State is getting guys in at this stage, they're going to be in it for the long haul. And so those are two names, Crumble and Reynolds, that I would very much keep in the back of your mind as names that you'll continue to hear about over the next couple of years. It's pretty rare that Michigan State has a kid come in for a visit as a sophomore and then just fall off the radar. It happens, but not often.
Okay.
So, and the fact that these are guys from traditional Michigan State recruiting territory, we've talked some about how they really have broadened their recruiting approach. We're seeing guys being recruited from parts of the country Michigan State has never really been heavily involved in before. But these two guys are not that anything but. They are from rock solid. They're guys who probably would have been MSU targets at any point in Tom Izzo's tenure, based on where they're from.
Well, it's pretty cool that all this is kind of heating up here. And of course, like I said, it's kickoff day for the football team. So I'll race and try and edit this and get this out so you at least can listen to this on your drive home from the game. And just a reminder too, Nudge Printing does great jobs. If you, for Spartan apparel, obviously gear, if you need it for your tailgates, they've got all the kind of unique stuff that you don't get at the student bookstore and other places. They have the vintage Sparties, all those licensed wear that you can't get anywhere else. And so nudgeprinting.com is a great place to go. High quality screen printed stuff. My family loves all the stuff we have. Very wearable. I've got the hoodie. It's very wearable and soft and comfortable, as are their t-shirts. And I just can't speak highly enough about them. They also have other schools in the state of Michigan and some just random schools around the country. So, you've got an Alma kid, or you've got a kid out at Saginaw Valley or Grand Valley State. You can get their shirts and stuff too. So you get 20% off by typing in Final Four in the coupon code if you're a listener to the show. Also, if you are a recurring patron, either through Patreon or Substack, you are automatically entered in a drawing every month to get some free gift cards for Nudge Printing, and we'll have that. We'll announce those every month. And so if you want to do that, of course, you can go over to thefinalfoursontheschedule.com/support. So check out Nudge Printing at nudgeprinting.com. You won't regret it. And I guess until next time, the Final Four is on the schedule. Go green.